It's the College Football Show presented by FantasyInsiders.com. Dan Strafford, Joe DeSalvo from the CFFsite.com, and of course, Fantasy Insider's own Ben Pritchett here with you on this Thursday night. We're with you every Thursday night during the college football season right here on Spreecast.com and then on YouTube and in podcast form over there on iTunes and Stitcher app and TuneIn and all the other apps that the GPP podcast goes to. This audio goes to as well. Gentlemen, we are into week 8 of the college football season. All of a sudden, we look towards the end of the season already. We're turning the midway point here as this quickly turns on us. Ben, quick reactions to week 7. Any storylines you're tracking from week 7 into week 8 that are worth at least staying on top of as we get into this discussion here?
Yeah, I mean, Corey Clement is definitely one we got to keep an eye on. Dressed last week, he's playing. Well, I'm assuming he plays this week. Definitely one to monitor. He said he'll play if he feels like it when he wakes up on Saturday, which is one of the most ridiculous statements ever. Which to me, he further went on to say that if you see me taking the first reps, then you'll know. And to me, that says I'm going to play. I'm going to take the first reps, but I'm not really going to tell you guys that. That's what it says to me. So his price is so cheap that he's definitely a guy we're going to have to monitor.
Joe, how about yourself? Storylines from week?
Yeah, same thing. I'm following that. And I think what's interesting is what's going on over there at Arizona right now at the quarterback position and running back. I mean, we've got some 50-50 plays right there. I think that's going to bear watching right up until late as well. On the early slate on Saturday.
We don't have an or situation for the Ohio State quarterback with J.D. Barrett getting the call, and we can talk about that more on the late slate as we will inevitably get into talking about how terrible the Rutgers secondary is in that contest. But, Ben, you mentioned a lot in Slack chat. I know you mentioned on Twitter, the comments here also. Some of this pricing is really strange this week, and I don't know if it's roster construction, if it's just simply an oversight or something that's changed. And we talk about algorithms all the time. It's easier to blame a computer than a human being sometimes, but it seems as though things have changed from a pricing perspective coming into this week.
Well, I mean, I think that they've upped the prices of quarterbacks, which they should, because you've got guys kind of rising to the top, and so you kind of have to adjust their prices accordingly. Well, if somebody's already very expensive and they're still performing past their salary for value, you have to start raising the prices. I mean, that's just the way it goes. Supply and demand, you want to make people think twice about it. And this week we actually are seeing them force us to make decisions on guys like Corey Coleman and Seth Russell and Greg Ward and all these guys that are extremely high priced on FanDuel. Now, DraftKings was already really tight, so they didn't have to adjust too much to change. I mean, these are pretty much the same prices we were dealing with last week, but FanDuel's definitely increasing prices for certain players, and they're also decreasing like tight end prices, which I know I tweeted about, which was you have just guys that are minimum price that have been 3K plus guys all year, just mysteriously dropping to minimum punt tight end prices. So that was confusing, but other than that, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. Makes sense at least.
We're at a point in the season where we are having gigantic prize pools when it comes to college football DFS. On FanDuel, the early slate for a $5 entry, you have $110,000 in guaranteed prizes. First place picking up $10,000, second $5,000 over on DraftKings. You have $125,000 on the line in the $3 GPP. First place 10, second place 7, third place 5. Ben, as we go through this season and you see these prize pools increase, and we see obviously on the NFL side what seems like a decrease in some prize pools. It seems like things not evening out clearly, but it seems like college football has gained its foothold, and we feel like we're in the season now, that we're a part of what's going on. As I said at the top, though, I feel like we're already turning the corner when we start to see November just around the corner. Is this get in while the getting is good, because all of a sudden we'll get into conference championships not far down the line?
Actually, they reduced the prize pools a little bit on FanDuel when I want to say that the champion's now getting 15K on, or 12K or something like that on, yeah, it's 12K on the $25 GPP, and it was 15K. So, I mean, it's still staying up there, which is great, and I want them to keep it up there, but they brought it down, and they were filling it up too, so I don't know quite why they're reducing that stuff, but, you know, they make their own decisions there. It's all about trying to make money, and I know they're losing some business in some states, so I don't know if they're quite at the point where they're putting that into their decisions on how many entries they're going to allow, you know?
We will have plenty to talk about when it comes to this early slate and a decent late slate as well to get through. But Ben, I did want to touch on something we were talking about before we started recording, and Joe, jump in here as well. When you're talking about these price tags on guys like Ward and Russell and Corey Coleman, we're now introducing a higher risk factor, right, Ben, in trying to roster these guys, that if someone like Corey Coleman goes out and gives us $120 and 1 TD, that's a fine outing for most wide receivers. But this price tag that FanDuel's putting out there, and on DraftKings, what's been his price tag, does that give you a little bit of pause in these lopsided sort of matchups that Baylor's encountering at this point?
Yeah, I mean, if he does 120 and a touchdown for 9,600 on FanDuel, that's gonna hurt you really bad. I mean, you might be fine in cash game play as long as you built the cheap guys around him properly. But I mean, if that's your tournament team and Corey Coleman only does that, then you better have been very lucky with some of your other selections, like your cheap running backs, because that's what you're going to have had to have done, or your cheap quarterback. And the likelihood of that happening just isn't high. There's too much predictability to college football. That's why we love it. That's why there's edge, is because you can sit there and look at a guy and say, okay, he's playing this defense. It's really bad. He's a focal point of the offense, and this is what he's good at. He's going to have a good game. And you're always able to do that for the most part, with some missing. But if you have a guy like Coleman who's priced so high that he's way ahead of everybody else, if you miss there, you're screwed. So yeah, it's very important to him.
I can't agree more, Ben. The only thing is that we've been talking about, it seems like every week now, we're in week 8, and it's happening every week. The consistency's just been there for the Corey Colemans and Josh Doxsons. They are giving everybody exactly their dollar's worth. And look, let's be honest. That's why you guys listen to the show out there, because to get some of these value plays at the end, to go ahead and stick with the Russells and the Corey Colemans and the Doxsons. To me, that's the whole fun, is to finding those value plays. But, to your point, if you do have a big guy like that, you're screwed if he just, if he doesn't do anything. But the one thing that's rung true is consistency for these guys, and so they haven't really let fantasy owners down. Not to say it's not going to happen, because it will, but so far they've been pretty true.
Ben, let's dive into this early slate, and we're talking before we went on live here on Spreecast about not a ton of gigantic over-unders. You have the Texas Tech game, and you have the Baylor game. Baylor game obviously has a pretty high implied team total for Baylor. 37.5 point favorite, I think, was the last that I saw there. What games are jumping out at you when you were doing your research? And if you want to then segue into starting to talk about some quarterbacks that you're on, of course you can find Ben's write-up going long, the early and late slate over on fantasyinsiders.com. If you are not yet a sub, it's fantasyinsiders.com/plans. Check it out. Ben's write-up alone is well worth a subscription to fantasyinsiders.com, but there is a ton of NFL content, NHL content, and I know Dave Loughran is chomping at the bit for the NBA just around the corner as well. But Ben, if you could, games you're on, and segue into quarterbacks.
Yeah, like you said, Baylor, Iowa State is going to be a big focal point for people just because it has that huge total, and you have a Baylor team that's trying to score 60 points for the 6th straight record time. So that's definitely a game you want to look at with Coleman, with Russell, and especially the running backs, which I think are going to be the ones that are going to be overlooked in this matchup. But when just looking at some of the other games, I think Washington State at Arizona. I think that's a great win. I love Luke Falk in that one. I think he's a guy I'm not hearing anybody really talk about, and he threw for 6 touchdowns and a half last week. And he has an upside that no other quarterback in this slate has, which is, 500 yards and 5 touchdowns. Well, he doesn't have the running ability that some of the other quarterbacks that are going to be the top guys have. But his ability to throw will really threaten an Arizona defense that's not prepared for a quarterback in a system like Washington State has. So I think that one's a good one. I think North Carolina, Virginia is a sneaky game, especially if you're looking at on the North Carolina side with Marquise Williams and all their talented guys. Virginia has been just awful against the pass, and I think that this might be the game that you finally see Marquise Williams get back to those consistent 40-point games that he was Greg Ward before Greg Ward was Greg Ward. And I think Greg Ward's a great play again this week, but I think he's going to get overused for his price, and he's been a lock for like 39-plus DraftKings points, and I'm not saying he's not a great option. And Central Florida has won a game, so you can make that argument, and I made that argument in the write-up. I wrote him up, but I mainly wrote him up to cover my ass. It's not necessarily a guy that I'm just going crazy to roster because he's just so expensive. He's priced right there with Seth Russell. So I have to be really confident. I actually think Central Florida's defense is okay. Beyond that, I would just throw in Michigan State versus Indiana, and as a team, I like Oklahoma State against Kansas for a lot of value.
Joe, how about yourself?
I agree with you with Marquise Williams, because when you look at the top guys, Seth Russell, we look at Luke Falk, Matt Johnson, Greg Ward, we know what we're going to get most of the time with those guys. But there's two that jump out at me this week that I don't think you have to go very top tier. I like Baker Mayfield at Oklahoma, and I do like Marquise Williams over there at North Carolina. So I know Mayfield, I think, is 8,700 on DraftKings. Marquise Williams, 8,200. If you want to get off of that top line, that might be two guys, in my opinion, to look at, because I do like that Oklahoma-Texas Tech game. If you're looking, as far as a bunch of players, there's some potential.
Now, Ben, from a roster construction standpoint, do you see a specific position you are looking to save at this week that may be different from weeks past, or is it simply piecing together what you see as best fit as you're getting your quarterbacks in line?
Well, I was starting to put together some – I usually wait till the last minute to do roster construction, like full-on roster construction, because I'm so broad-minded with the way you write. You have to be kind of looking at all the people. So I don't try to narrow in until the very end. And I've already started to work on it because I was helping a buddy with the team. And when I was putting together rosters, it gets really difficult. If you're not writing, again, like we've talked about this, the 5K running backs, on DraftKings, and you can do whatever you want on FanDuel. That's a given. Like that, people, when you go into FanDuel, you attack FanDuel with who do I like, and you need to start. And I'm going to give you some roster construction stuff. You start with who do you like. So if you really like Aaron Burbridge, which I do, I'll put him in. If you really like Corey Coleman, put him in. And if you really like Seth Russell, put him in, and then build around them. And FanDuel makes it so easy with the 2K tight ends that they have this week, the Elijah Hood's underpriced, all these other guys that are cheap enough to where you can work a few minimum price other options to get all the guys that you really want. Now on DraftKings, you're going to need to work in the guys you don't really want, but you have to have and get lucky with, and that's going to be the Pirines or Mixons, the guys that have underperformed or haven't gotten a chance. When I was helping him with his team, I threw Pirine and Mixon in on the same team for a GPP, because I just think that strategy of hitting a bad running game in a situation where everybody's going to be off of them, they're all going to be looking into the spread pass, which makes sense. And I'm not saying it's not a smart way. I'm saying just if you're going opposite of minded thinking, a Pirine Mixon game makes a lot of sense with that really, really bad run defense. And you're going to need guys like that. You're going to need the 3.5K receivers that have flown under radars as maybe tight ends, or, guys that just have had few, bulk catches, and they get a lot of their big plays in like one or two catches. So things like that is going to help you build.
Yep. We'll keep an eye on all the roster construction there. Some good comments going on in the chat, comparing Russell and Ward, and talking about taking Coleman and moving on from there, as Ben was just discussing on FanDuel. Certainly,
I think the way people are talking in chat should give you an idea of the mindset for people when you play, and that's going to be there's going to be a heavy emphasis on Seth Russell and Corey Coleman. And so if they go Seth Russell, Corey Coleman, and you don't, and those guys, like Baylor's defense is bad enough to where Iowa State could, stick, that game could score like just a ton of points. And in cash games, you got to keep that in your mindset. You got to say, okay, I have to have one of these guys in cash games. I just have to. But when it comes to GPPs, if you're playing Seth Russell and Corey Coleman in the same team on a GPP, I don't think you're winning.
Right, you need to hit everything else spot on and have those values, as you said before, Ben, all come through at top dollar per point or point per dollar, I guess I should say, to really fill it out. Whereas maybe, as Joe said, taking a step down at quarterback, taking a step down at some of these top wide receiver one, and maybe pairing number two wide receivers along with a second-tier quarterback may give you the variance you're looking for and enough value across the way to piece it together as a GPP play. Cash games, completely on board. It's something that FI talks about regularly, about game theory, about understanding if guys are going to be 60, 70, 80% owned, you need to be involved in that ownership in case the upside and the downside come through. Joe, why don't you kick us off with running backs this week? You guys already started to touch on some. We talked about a few before we started discussing, before we came on live for the show tonight. What running backs are you keeping an eye on? And over at the CFF site, what are you guys looking from a rankings perspective for this early slate? Is there somebody that jumps out at you that maybe off some of our radars?
You know, there's some guys that I don't know if they're necessarily off the radar. I think there's some good value plays here. I mean, we loved Derrick Henry last week, and then you look over at DraftKings, he's the highest rated running back this week by about $700 compared to Alex Collin. I mean, you got Shock Linwood. I think some things that bears watching as well is what's going to go on over there, at Arizona. Is Nick Wilson going to play? Is Baker going to get in there? What's going to go on with the new Solomon and at the quarterback position? So I think some real intriguing options there. So where Ben mentioned Arizona, Washington State, I think there's a little risk involved right there unless we get some early news on what could go on over there at Arizona. But, there's a guy in there that I like with the early slate. And I'm going to touch a little bit too, Ben. You mentioned Joe Mixon as well. I mean, looking at air raid offense that they have at Oklahoma under Lincoln Riley, it just seems to me that Joe Mixon is a better fit than Samaje Perine. The problem is that Texas Tech's run defense is so bad. I can see Perine having a good game, but I happen to like Mixon a little better this week. And there's a guy that I love in this early slate that's only, 5,600? Saquon Barkley, Penn State. We've been talking about him. He came back healthy last week. He's played in only 2 Big Ten games. He's rushed for 190 yards in both of those games. It's only a matter of time before he really cashes in a big one with some touchdowns.
Now, Ben, you've mentioned a couple of different names already from a value perspective. When you talk about guys like Elijah Hood and Corey Clement on a slate like this, are their floors trustable, if that's even a word, or can you trust their floors enough for what you're expecting to slot them in as somewhat more value plays or mid-tier guys and pay up at quarterback? Or do you see sort of a pairing of a top-tier running back and a mid-tier or even low-tier running back, the play this week, especially from your viewpoint from a tournament perspective?
Well, if North Carolina wasn't run by a bunch of dummies, Elijah Hood would be a safe play. But they are run by dummies, so he isn't a safe play. And they're being successful with barely using him, so that's also concerning. But he is just a hoss and a really good back who's wasted in North Carolina. And he's so cheap and so desirable to me that I get caught on him a little bit because I think he's just better. I think he's in better spots than he actually is, and this might be one of those. So to say he has a high floor isn't really great, Same thing with Joe Mixon and Perine. I mean, I like those guys, but their floors aren't safe, and that's why they're cheap. But like you look at a guy like Clement, who we just mentioned with the injury thing, we have no clue how many carries he's going to get if he plays. I mean, if he plays, he's probably going to start, but does he get 8 carries? Does he get 15 carries? If he gets 15 carries, he's going to boss against Illinois. I mean, he's going to have a great game. So you get a $4,200 back who has potential for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns. It's just the problem with that whole thing is you're just guessing at that point is what's his workload going to be. So none of these guys are safe. You can take it down. I'm going through some of my cheap guys. Chris Carson for Oklahoma State. Everybody's calling for Rennie Childs now because they think Chris Carson's not the guy. But Carson has been playing hurt last week. He hasn't really gotten his fair shake, and this is a guy that was like JUCO Player of the Year last year. So I'm not quite the guy who I think having bad floors is okay. Having where you could get like 6 points is okay. That's just part of daily fantasy. If you're walking around playing like that, then you're going to lose a lot of times anyways.
It's a lot of
here's one thing too, Ben, to add on to that. There's two guys on this early slate that really could go for 150 yards and 3 touchdowns if you want to take a chance on them. And it's a guy that I loved at the beginning of the year, but he's been banged up, is Kareem Hunt, who's only 6,400. I mean, is this the game where he finally comes out of his sling? You pair Kareem Hunt with Corey Clement before everybody has a chance to jump on him and they have a monster game. You could be really hitting on something big right there. It may be a bit of a long shot, a bit of a gamble, but those are two guys right there that are not max priced that could run for $150 and score 3 touchdowns apiece.
Continue the discussion on to wide receiver here. We touched on Corey Coleman, probably enough to move on from him. We know the situation. We know what he's done so far this year. We know what the Baylor offense can do and what they most likely will do this weekend. It's just whether or not he hits value or not. And he has shown that he can do it week over week, but it is going to take a little bit more to pay up for him on FanDuel at 9,600. And 8,600 over on DraftKings. Now, Ben, let me ask you this question from a game theory or from a roster construction standpoint. When you have somebody like Corey Coleman, who is 1,900 more than the next closest wide receiver on FanDuel, does that factor into how you're thinking of him and that you have to that big variance in price tag, whereas on DraftKings, it's a tighter array from Corey Coleman down to Roger Lewis?
We covered this, Dan. No, I'm just kidding. Seriously though, I mean, like if you look at the way FanDuel has his price at 9,600, you're talking about like he's priced like a quarterback or like an elite running back. So he's not saying he can't deliver. He's probably going to deliver on that price. But from a roster construction standpoint, like you said, you can get a receiver for 7,100 who has a really good shot of 100+ yards. I mean, like Tyler Boyd, for example. I mean, he's on DraftKings, but just like a guy like that who has potential for easily 100 yards and multiple touchdowns. So that's to me like the way my brain works is it sees 9,600 and it says, I don't know if that's what we want to do. It's just that's the way I look at it. I feel like I can attack another guy like a Gabe Marks or get lucky with another pick. And then I get my Saquon Barkley and, Kareem Hunt. If I want to do those 2 running backs and a good quarterback, you can't have Corey Coleman. Sorry. It's not going to happen.
And that's more than, I know we discussed earlier the wide receiver spot and the difference in pricing, but more the actual how your brain works and seeing the difference in price from that number one price tag at 96 all the way down to 7,700. Is that an immediate sort of flag to you, no matter who the player is, no matter how good the matchup is, to move on, even from a bias perspective, how it triggers what your research is going to be and how you're going to I listen when you talk, Ben. You have to.
No, it's okay. I was just messing with you. I mean, we went through the same thing. It's important to note that we went through the same thing with Jordan Lynch. There was a time period early in the FanDuel days when Jordan Lynch was like 14K and like the next guy would be 9. And you would have to go with the battle of, am I going to do Jordan Lynch and his 300 yards rushing and 4 touchdowns, or am I going to, try to tough it out with, I don't know, Dak Prescott? And you had to battle that every single time, and so that was tough. And Corey Coleman's become the Jordan Lynch of wide receivers.
So Joe, if we're talking through this slate of these wide receivers, Ben, we'll come back to some of your plays here as well. If we get beyond Corey Coleman, we get beyond the concern of could this be the week that he doesn't match that price tag. What wide receiver storylines or opportunities are you tracking this week as top plays and opportunities to maybe exceed a little bit of value?
Well, look, we've been talking about consistency all season long at the receiver position, and you got Roger Lewis right there. He's not, he's no Corey Coleman, but at DraftKings for $1,600 cheaper, he's still giving you pretty good consistency. You got the Tajay Sharps there. I'm a person, look, if you like Marks and Dom Williams, who are at 6,700 and 5,600, and you're stacking them with Luke Falk, I couldn't even fault you there. Ben, I'm glad to see you were on Tyler Boyd because I was going to mention that name. So I'm glad to see we're on the same wavelength this week. I mean, look, he's got 7 catches in 2 straight games, has scored in 2 straight games. I mean, he's got potential right there. He's only 6,500. And look, just a few other guys right there. We're talking Bowling Green. You got Garrett Dieter, who, I mean, look, he's got at least 6 catches and 70 yards in 2 straight games. You got D.D. Westbrook. I talked about how much I love that Oklahoma-Texas Tech game. I mean, you've got Sterling Shepard. D.D. Westbrook's only 5,300. I think he's interesting. So I think there's a lot of value here. In the early slate in the receiver, Quentin Bundridge, Iowa State, only 4,300. He's got 70 yards in his last 2 games. They're playing Baylor. It's going to be a wide open game, and there's a bunch of options there.
Now, Ben, we've talked a couple weeks in a row right now about Calvin Ridley, and he's the sort of name that I know you're a big fan of, but in college football especially, it seems as though as fans and as analysts, we can sit here and say, why aren't they playing this guy more? Why aren't they doing more to get this guy the ball? Talked about Elijah Hood in that respect earlier. How frustrating, one, can it be to sort of try to figure out what's going to happen? And 2, in college, do you see the tide turn faster? That's a terrible pun on my part. Did not mean that. But do you see it move? Really did not mean that one. Do you see it move faster than you may see it in other sports where it takes a manager longer to get away from the guys they recruited earlier, the guys they like more? Or do you see it take a longer period of time because of the win now mentality of you can't lose a single game?
Yeah, I think some of that's true. I think in this particular case, you're dealing with an offense that's a run-first offense. So their idea is to get Derrick Henry the ball and Kenyon Drake, but Kenyon Drake's hurt, so now it's all Derrick Henry. And then you throw to Ridley or Darius Stewart if the play call goes to that. You do the play action and then you throw to those guys. Ridley has become the guy. I mean, Stewart, if you look at Stewart's targets, they've declined every single week, and he's been getting like 3 and 4 the last 2 weeks. So even though Ridley isn't minimum price and he's not getting like double-digit targets every week, he's still a really good play against Tennessee defense that's weak in the secondary and is actually weak at linebacker too. So I actually think he's a great play, even though they bumped up his price on both sides.
Yeah, they did bump up his price, and I do like Ridley because, there was a play last week against A&M, and look, Ridley led Alabama in receiving last week, but there was one play on that play action. Henry was just having a monster game where Ridley was wide open and Coker got sacked, and I'm telling you, if he was able to deliver that ball, Ridley would have had another 70 yards and a touchdown. And so, look, Tennessee's defensive line is not what Texas A&M has. Couple of those play action throws goes deep to Ridley. You could be looking at another 100, 150 yards and touchdown this week. I agree with you there, Ben. I do.
So, Ben, who's a wide receiver that you'd prefer other players didn't know about this week?
Oh, that's a tough question. I wasn't ready for that one. It's a very loaded question. There's some wide receivers. Can I change it a little bit? There's some wide receivers that I wish I knew more about. And that would be the Oklahoma State core of receivers, because they're coming into a game that I think could be monstrous for some of those guys. And I was a Brandon Shepard lover towards the end of last year. I mean, I was running him out every single chance I could get, and it was working out for me. And then this year, just disappearing act, and I don't know what's going on. He's not even really getting targets. And then you have Glidden, you have Washington, you have Altman. I mean, you got all these dudes that are taking a lot of – that it could come in to be huge plays, and they're all super cheap on FanDuel. So those guys are all – I wish I knew more. I wish I knew more about Cody Cook, who is a wide receiver that has worked 2 halves as a quarterback in the last couple games, who could actually start this game at quarterback, even though it's against Texas. He's good running. He has good running ability. He's the best athlete on the team. So if you're looking at him as a $3,800 wide receiver on DraftKings, if he starts at quarterback and uses his ability to run against a Texas defense that has struggles against run, they're good against the pass, they struggle against the run. I actually think Cook just has innate built-in value with that situation. If that's what happens, you just have to stay in tune with Twitter. They're not really letting it out who is the starter, which I think there's some safer options like Kanan Severin and Chris Godwin. Let's see if I have anybody else. I think Antoine Dixon is a guy people might be overlooking for Kent State against Bowling Green. He's minimum price, a true minimum. I always try to find one of those guys. He's $3,000. He is their new Dree Archer. So, I mean, obviously he's not actually Dree Archer, but he's a little dude that's shifty, that can break away. They used Raekwon James as their running back last week, but Dixon is that kind of flexy guy that, is the lightning. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, a couple of names I'll throw out there as well that I do like. They're not high priced, but Alec Erickson over there at Wisconsin on DraftKings 4,600, and Ricardo Lewis, Auburn. I like him. Now that they don't have Duke Williams anymore, he had a big week last week. He's $5K going against Arkansas, and I don't think Auburn's going to be able to do a lot on the ground, so I think he'd be an interesting play.
Then a quick touch on tight ends here for guys playing over on FanDuel. I know Rodney Mills' price tag is up at $4,000 for Massachusetts. UMass obviously there, but you mentioned previously a number of guys down at the 2K level. Is this a situation of finding one of those 2K guys and take your savings and move on?
I don't think you have a choice. They're forcing you to do that. I mean, Rodney Mills is a great punt wide receiver on DraftKings, but as a 4,000, even though he's so influential, he's had like 390-plus straight games. That makes me excited, but at the same time, I see these guys that are 2K, and I see what all I could do with my lineup. If you're running Corey Coleman out and you're running Rodney Mills out, you're going to have a kind of jacked up lineup. So you have to kind of take what it gives you, and they're giving you 2K tight ends, and maybe you see Mills as a 100-yard and a multiple touchdown option, which he definitely is. You just can't go there when they're making you take 2K tight ends.
In chat, you have Josiah the Messiah, as referenced by Travis Wilson, referencing Josiah Price, I would assume, from Michigan State. Is a 2K price tag tight end over on FanDuel. Great nickname if that is in fact what you came up with, Travis. Well done. If it's out there in the ether somewhere, that works as well. But Joe, any tight ends for you that are on your radar from a season-long perspective that you think may have big weeks this week before we move on to some quick hits on the late slate?
I don't know if they're going to have big weeks, but if you're looking to save, $500 on tight end, I think Jordan Leggett for Clemson's just an interesting play just because he seems to be a scoring threat. So you don't have to, you can save money there, but it's kind of hard to go against Mills just for the difference in money, in my opinion, unless you're just going super, super cheap.
Travis, we'll give you credit here on the college football show. You don't need to credit anybody else. That's fine. We can move on to this late slate, Ben, and I know you were excited to see JT Barrett get the starting nod well in advance of this Saturday. We know there's no Orr in the depth chart there, and he's going up against a young, inefficient, terrible secondary for the Scarlet Knights of Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. Is JT Barrett a feature of yours this week? And do you think this is sort of at least the coming out party for Ohio State of realizing that Cardell Jones, as much as he did last year, and it was a wonderful run for this team, JT Barrett's the future and what they really need to focus on?
I think you didn't preface that quite 100% accurately. You left out something from last week. What did you leave out? What was the hot take of the week?
Yes. I said it.
Come on, man.
I did not say it online. You nailed it. The Indiana Rutgers game was absolutely absurd, and
Sudfeld not only started, but he had a career passing yardage day. I called it.
460 something, I think, in the end. Though the interceptions did catch up with him towards the end, you did nail it.
Yeah, I don't
care.
care.
That was a hot take for the ages.
When he almost hit it by halftime, I was like, "Oh man, this is awesome!" Like I was pretty excited about that hot take. But yeah, I mean, I only said that hot take because I had that little faith in your Rutgers secondary, and if Sudfeld can do it, JT Barrett can do it, and JT Barrett's gonna be pumped. I mean, I know people don't like to play into those kind of narratives, but he's going to be pumped getting this start, and he's been performing better than Cardell Jones when given opportunities, and he can air it out. He hasn't really done it yet because of the way he's been used in the red zones and things like that. But if it's his job and he gets to just take off with it, I could see a lot of success from him and possibly a Braxton Miller type. I really don't know how they're going to handle their wide receivers. Is it going to be Jalen Marshall? Is it going to be Braxton Miller? Is it going to be Michael Thomas, who's been their most successful guy with Cardale Jones? But I don't know if Michael Thomas is going to have that same kind of rapport with JT Barrett. But I love JT Barrett. I love him for his legs, and that's why you get him. I mean, you don't really worry too much about his receivers.
Yeah, you don't worry about who he's going to throw the ball. I couldn't agree with you more. JT Barrett, I'm on the bus this week. It was only a matter of time. I don't know how he doesn't have a big game. I mean, I'm just looking at him right now. I mean, I even on DraftKings, I got Doty over Barrett. I just don't see that this week with Doty going against LSU. I think they're going to score some points, but couldn't agree with you more. Love Barrett.
Speaking,
it's a love fest.
The other quarterbacks at the position on the slate, Ben, anybody else outside of JT Barrett? There are some big names playing that typically we do see a little bit more often in the early slate here. So it feels like a much better late slate than we've had over the past couple of weeks. What other QBs do you have an eye on? And actually, if you don't mind, in the interest of time, why don't we touch on some of your top plays for this late slate? The Going Long early edition will be out tomorrow. The late slate will come out later on Friday or early Saturday morning for you guys to peruse and get ready for college football on Saturday. But Ben, if you don't mind, take us home here on the late slate, and Joe, chime in after Ben is all set.
Okay, yeah, I won't spend too much time. I'll just kind of list off some guys. JT Barrett, of course. Dak Prescott, of course, is the high-priced guys. I like Seth Collins and Everett Golson as mid-priced options. Collins, people are going to be off of him, but facing a Colorado defense, he's showing that running ability again. Rushed for over 120 yards against Washington State last week. He's going to have that bounce back. He's healthy. I love him. Tolles is a cheaper option at quarterback. If you go to running backs, or you want me to go on to running backs there, Dan? And run through them?
Run through. Yep.
Okay. I like the obvious, the Cook, the Fournette, the Ezekiel Elliott's. I'm a little concerned about Ezekiel Elliott, and the only reason why is because in the past with Ohio State, when they had a running quarterback like a Braxton Miller, like a JT Barrett, it seemed like the running game for the actual running back dropped. And when they had like Cardale Jones, that's when Ezekiel Elliott was really thriving. So I'm a little concerned there, but not like overly concerned. I still think Elliott's a hoss and is going to have a good game. Brian Hill, McNichols. Hill goes up against the Boise State defense. It's like one of the top 5 run defenses in the country. But Brian Hill is one of the few running backs that I would take a risk on because he's cheaper. I don't necessarily think you have to force him in. I'd rather you go cheaper at running back with Storm Woods or Philip Lindsay or Guice even, or is it Guice? Do you know that, Joe? Is it Guice or Guice for LSU?
I don't. I have no idea. It sounds good either way.
Yeah, I have no idea. He hasn't played enough. Yeah, he hasn't played enough for me to know his name. When I only watch Leonard Fournette.
We could just call him Juice.
Juice. Okay, yeah, I like that. Okay, so Juice against Western Kentucky is going to be a sneaky play. He's 3,500 on DraftKings, so he's going to be a guy that gets overlooked. If that game blows out, and even if it doesn't blow out, they've been using him enough to where he has a lot of value at 3,500. Joe, you got anybody on running backs you want to hit on before I move to wide receivers?
You know what? I mean, until Jeremy McNichols was hurt and sat out a game, he was leading the FBS in scoring. I think for him over there, I mean, when you look at Leonard Fournette, Dalvin Cook, if you don't want to take any of those top guys, I think McNichols is a very interesting play. As far as some of the cheaper options, and I'll throw out some names out there, maybe Trey Carson, because he's probably going to get 20-plus carries going against Ole Miss. Ole Miss isn't exactly the shutdown defense. And a name I'll throw out there, I really like this guy moving forward, the freshman at Georgia Tech, Marcus Marshall. I think he's got a tough matchup this weekend, but for 3,900, that guy's been, he's been proven one play he could be gone. It'll be tough against Florida State this week, but I still think there's some value there.
How about some wide receivers from you, Ben, on this late slate?
Yeah,
we'll wrap it up in there.
You got it. I totally agree with everything you just said. Marcus Marshall is in there as one of my cheap running backs as well. Treadwell, Spurbeck. I love Spurbeck. with Rippon throwing him the ball. I love him. I think he's just amazing with Rippon throwing. Now, Rippon struggled last week, but Spurbeck did not. Spurbeck doesn't struggle when he has a capable quarterback behind center, and Wyoming is going to really have a tough time going to the blue field. So I like that. I like Kirk in what could be an under the radar play because I think people just automatically dismiss Texas A&M Ole Miss, but that game could really turn into like a back and forth. So I like him. He even performed last week in a bad game. Spruce, I love Spruce. Shea Fields is probably going to be out if he's not already ruled out. You'd have to help me on that, Joe. But I'm assuming
Fields has actually been ruled out. I think Spruce is a great Fields. I don't think is playing, so I think Spruce is a great play.
All
this
the targets,
week. And I'm with you.
All the targets,
yeah,
all the targets. So that's one of those options where when you looked at Spruce in his best time was when he was getting all the targets. It wasn't until at the beginning of 2014 was when he burst onto the scene and everybody's like, "Who's this guy?" And then he fell apart, and that didn't fell apart, but he fell down and became more of a normal wide receiver. And he hasn't really gotten back to that peak, and he still is in my mind. I know he is in Joe's too. We all think of, when we think of Spruce, we think of the guy that was 150 yards receiving every game. Yep. And I think he brings us back into that, and he's super cheap on both sides.
Yeah, I got 5 quick names. I like Spruce, Spurbeck, like you mentioned. I think Malachi Dupree, even out at LSU, has been hot. It's a good play for $41K on DraftKings. Victor Bolden, I think, is cheaper than Jordan Villeman. And, here's another play as well. Only $3,900 on DraftKings. Garrett Johnson, wide receiver, Kentucky. He's gone over 100 in 2 of his last 3. They play Mississippi State this weekend. He could challenge another 100 yards at a cheap play.
Some great options there. We're going to get to Joe's start sit in just a few moments, but Ben, follow up there?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say a couple other cheap options. Villeman, Fred Ross is super cheap on DraftKings. He's only $3,700. He's still a target monster for Dak Prescott. Dorian Baker's one of the top red zone targets in the whole college football. They use Johnson to move the ball, but then they go to Baker when they want a touchdown. So that's definitely a guy to watch. He's super cheap on both sites. Seals Jones is starting to wake up. And the last guy I'll mention is another guy. I've never actually seen this guy play, so pardon me. But his name's Jake Malhart. I think he's a white guy playing for Wyoming against Boise. He is $3,200 on DraftKings. They are probably going to be without Travis Gentry. So you're looking at a guy.
They will be. Yeah.
Okay, there you go. So they're going to be having a wide receiver who's capable of taking over all the targets, and they use their tight end a lot. But I think he has a lot of potential for $3,200 as your punt.
And Ben, finally at tight end, I believe Tyler Higbee is doubtful, which you don't see often in college football. Sat out practice on Thursday. Joe, maybe you have some more information there on Higbee, but if you're going to look at tight end, is it a similar process on FanDuel where there are cheap options that you're being forced to, or is the late slate a little different than the early slate?
I think Perkins is become a integral part of the Washington offense, so I will give him a look against Stanford. It's not ideal. I think Hooper's a great play against Washington because Washington's best ability is stopping the run. So I don't know what they're going to do with focusing on McCaffrey, but if they do that, then a guy like Hooper across the middle could be a nice option. But, I mean, when it comes to actually rostering a tight end, I'm probably going to fall for Wally like I did last week and thought he was going to play and he got ruled out the last second. I'm probably going to fall for him at 2K or Hollister at 2,400 or maybe even Jake Rowe. I haven't really quite looked at it too hard, but Hollister will probably become the number 2 option for the Wyoming passing game. And Cameron Kaufman, he throws a lot. He leads the conference in passing yardage. So I think that they'll be playing from behind. So you're going to see a lot of passes. So that Hollister kid may get a lot of targets.
So Ben, hang tight. You had a enormous hot take last week that came through in epic proportions. So we will come back to you for your hot take of the week as we head off. But first, you can sit back, relax, put your tray table in the upright and lock position, Ben, as we have Joe's start sit coming at you. So we're all going to take a deep breath and let Joe take it away.
All right, guys. So here we go. Week 8 already. And, for you season-long folks, we're already on the back end of the season here. We're getting close to the playoffs. And, what's interesting, Ben and Dan, is that I'm starting to get guys now that are emailing me saying, you know what, I'm sort of out of my league. I'm kind of I'm folding the tent. Give me some names for keepers for next year, but I'm going to try my hand over there in DFS. And so that's, I think, where hopefully some guys are coming along for the ride with you guys. And, but anyway, look, this is what we're going to do. Start bench, underperformers, overperformers, week 8. Here we go. We're past the halfway point. And so some guys we're going to caution fantasy owners this week, caution you DFS players out there, how we have guys ranked compared to how they actually could perform. We like Brandon Doty at Western Kentucky. He's just been a statistical machine this year, but he is traveling to LSU this week. I still think he's going to put up decent numbers. We have him ranked at 23, but I still want to caution fantasy owners this week. They're going up against the big boys, right? Travis Wilson, we have him at 31, going on the road at USC. I think that could be a scary game for Utah. I'm a little worried about Travis Wilson performing up to his 31 ranking this week. Donnell Pumphrey, running back, Utah, playing Utah State, San Diego State. We have him ranked at 17 this week. He's had 2 good weeks in a row, but Utah State is one of the better defenses in that conference. A little worried about that ranking. And Mike Warren. Mike Warren has played exceptionally well with Iowa State. They're playing against Baylor this week. I like Baylor's defense better than I think most people do. We have Warren ranked at 27, but I'm worried if that game gets out of hand, we could see him sidelined a little early and maybe Iowa State take to the air very often. And then if we're going to go caution fantasy owners is about Brandon Doty, I think we got to caution them about Taywan Taylor at 22, and even Kieras Garrett over there at Tulsa at 23, going up against a good Memphis team. And right now, Tulsa has some things going on at quarterback that we just don't like. We'll touch on in the start bench. Now, guys, we do like that could overperform their rankings. J.T. Barrett at number 22. We talked about how much we love him. He could outperform his rankings. And for you season-long guys, David Washington, new quarterback at Old Dominion. We have him ranked at 40. We like him a little higher this week. Running back, Saquon Barkley, we have him at 22, and Corey Clement at 37. I think both of those guys I think both of them can outperform their numbers. And wide receivers, we mentioned Nelson Spruce a little early. We have him ranked 35. Looks like Shea Fields won't play. And Corey Davis, we have at 38 this week going against Miami of Ohio. Daniel Braverman's been the man, but I think Corey Davis, this could be the week he outperforms his rankings for the first time in a while. So there's your week 8 overperformer, underperformers. We're going to get right into the week 8 start bench guys, and we're just going to touch on the guys that are on the DFS slates. If you want the rest of the list, we'll have that start bench up on the website a little later tonight. But we're going to go ahead and start with the bench list, and we're going to start with the guy that plays on Friday night. We mentioned Kieras Garrett in our caution piece, but Dane Evans, quarterback Tulsa, right? Since his 4 TD performance against Oklahoma in week 3, he's only accounted for 3 scores in Tulsa's previous 3 games. He's already without his best receiver, Kevin Lucas, and now freshman quarterback Chad President is stealing snaps out of the Wildcat formation, which only reduces Evans' fantasy potential headed into a Week 8 matchup against a good Memphis team. We're calling for the bench. Dane Evans, quarterback Tulsa, Week 8 bench going against Memphis. And then we're going to go to Alabama, Tennessee, and it's becoming like a weekly thing for us where we're mentioning somebody against Alabama every week. Well, Josh Dobbs, right? 2 weeks ago in Tennessee's win over Georgia, he became just the 3rd SEC quarterback in the last 15 years to pass for 300 yards and run for 100 yards in the same game. But you know what? College fantasy football, it's all about playing the matchups. And we got to warn Dobbs' owners that he's only accounted for 1 touchdown in the previous 2 starts before that game when he played against Florida and Arkansas. So we're going to call for Josh Dobbs at Alabama, a Week 8 bench. And while we're on the Tennessee-Alabama game, we're going to go to Jalen Hurd. He's topped 100 yards in 3 of Tennessee's first 4 games, and he accounted for 8 touchdowns during that span, but he failed to score or top 90 yards in each of his previous 2 starts. That trend could continue this week when the Volunteers travel to Alabama and face one of the nation's top defenses. Jalen Hurd, also a Week 8 bench for Tennessee at Alabama. And then we're going to go with Anu Solomon, quarterback, Arizona, playing Washington State. Coach Rodriguez has already, he's let it be known that we can expect to see both quarterbacks, Gerard Randall and Anu Solomon, against the Cougars this week on Saturday. So if Solomon's snap counts are reduced, so is his fantasy potential. We're calling for a Week 8 bench, Anu Solomon, quarterback, Arizona, playing Washington State. And the last bench we'll mention tonight Anthony Wales, running back, Western Kentucky, playing at LSU. You know, look, we find it difficult to say that an important piece of a Western Kentucky offense is a bad play, but Wales just may not be the safest play because his carry, you know, he probably carries a little bit more value in leagues and formats that carry points per reception because LSU is going to neutralize him on the ground. The Tigers have not allowed an opposing running back to rush for more than 70 yards so far this season. So we're calling Anthony Wales, Week 8 bench, Western Kentucky, playing at LSU. Now we're going to end up with the start slot, guys, and we got 4 names we're going to throw for you tonight that are on DFS slates. The first one we're going to mention is a wide receiver, Kermit Whitfield, wide receiver, Florida State, playing at Georgia Tech. Everett Golson just looks like a different quarterback recently. And you know what? The 5'7" junior receiver, he's provided some playmaking ability on the outside to complement Dalvin Cook, running back Dalvin Cook. He's caught Kermit Whitfield has caught 9 passes in each of his previous 2 games for a total of 267 yards, and he's now scored in 2 of the Seminoles' previous 3 games. We like him as a Week 8 start at receiver playing at Georgia Tech. And here we go. We're going to end with 3 freshmen. First one we're going to mention, guys, Joe Mixon, running back Oklahoma. I mentioned earlier that I like Joe Mixon. You know, he received a season-high 15 carries last week and cashed those in for 73 yards and a score. In fact, he's probably a better fit, and I mentioned this earlier, in offensive coordinator Lincoln Riley's offense than running back Samaje Perine. This week, Oklahoma hosts Texas Tech, a matchup which should produce a wide-open aerial show and create a lot of open space for Mixon. We like Joe Mixon, running back Oklahoma, Week 8 start, playing versus Texas Tech. L.J. Scott. You know, Scott isn't exactly churning out the yardage. Running back, Michigan State. They're playing Indiana. But the freshman has scored at least 2 touchdowns in 3 consecutive games, and he puts that streak on the line in Week 8 when the Spartans host Indiana. The Hoosiers have given up 170 yards per game on the ground and have given up 14 rushing touchdowns this year. That's tied for last in the Big Ten, and they're giving up 4.9 yards per carry, which is worse than the Big Ten. We're calling for L.J. Scott to keep that trend continuing. We're calling for a Week 8 start, running back, Michigan State playing Indiana. And it wouldn't be the start bench anymore if we didn't end it with another freshman. So we're going to do that this week. A freshman we love, probably more than a ranking. I love this guy this week. Saquon Barkley, running back, Penn State, playing at Maryland. Guys, Barkley has only played in 2 Big Ten games in his young career, and he has topped 190 yards rushing both times. It's a bit of a stretch to suggest that he was going to top 200 yards this week in Week 8, but he should be more than productive against a Maryland defense that has given up 196 yards per game on the ground, which is second worst in the Big Ten. We're going to end it right here. Week 8, start Saquon Barkley. Get him in your lineups and watch him produce. That, my guys, is your Week 8 start bench.
Joe, great content as always. You can check more of the start bench and the rankings over at the CFFsite.com. Joe, the voice of the CFF site, joining us every week here on the Thursday College Football Spreecast at 11 p.m. Available via podcast on iTunes, the Stitcher app, TuneIn, and on YouTube as well. Will be posted early tomorrow morning. Benjamin, coming off of a week like last week, where by halftime your hot take was already well on its way to coming through. It is time now for your Week 8 hot take, and I can only assume, well, I'm not gonna assume, but I feel that there could be a good trend rolling of picking on a certain team from New Jersey as we move forward. But I don't know if that's where you're gonna go this week, but I do feel as though that could certainly be a good trend to follow as Rutgers defense will continue to struggle. But why don't you lay it on us? Who's your hot take of the week in college football Week 8?
Well, you would think that would be where I should go, and I'm playing it a little safer than last week because I felt like last week was really gutsy, and I got maybe a little lucky on that one. But my hot take of the week is going to be to revolve around a guy I haven't mentioned, and I didn't mention him on purpose, and that's Christian Jones, and he's a wide receiver for Northwestern. They're going up against Nebraska, who is allowing the worst 341.7 yards per game of any team in passing in the country. So, we're dealing with a quarterback that's terrible. I understand that. but you're also dealing with a wide receiver who's a senior. He's got an NFL body who had the eyes of NFL scouts at one point in his career. He's getting the majority of their targets, even though it's not a lot. I think you're going to see him get his second 100-yard game of his entire career as a receiver. He missed all of 2014 with something. I don't even know what it was, but he ended his 2013 year with a 13-catch, 182-yard, 2-touchdown performance. I'm not calling that. Not that gutsy. I'm not calling that. But I am going to say he gets over 100 yards and probably a touchdown. I'm going to add in another hot take because that one wasn't quite sizzling enough. I think Aaron Burbridge outscores Corey Coleman, and you can lock that one down.
Wow.
There you have it. We have a mostly hot take and a scorching hot take at the end here. Ben, we appreciate it as always. We're going to leave it there. We're just going to let that hang out. We're going to remember Sudfeld forever, and we hope that Ben's hot take comes through as scorching as it did last week. Joe, thanks so much for the time tonight. Check him out at thecffsite.com for the start bench and the rankings as you get ready for Saturday college football on DraftKings, FanDuel, and all the rest of the sites. Ben, you're right up, coming up. They're going long. Early slate will be up on Friday morning, late slate later on in the day. As always, Ben, great stuff. And you can find Ben on Twitter at Natural Slugger, Joe and the CFF site at the CFF site on Twitter. And Ben is part of the member chat most Saturday mornings leading up to kickoff for college football, depending on schedules, of course. But if you have the time and are a member, stay tuned for that over on fantasyinsiders.com. If you're not yet, fantasyinsiders.com/plans. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, guys. Wish you the best of luck on Saturday. We'll see you next week right here on Spreecast.com with the College Football Show presented by fantasyinsiders.com.